Hey guys, what is up? So we're back with the same exact cards that we did the initial impressions earlier today, but I wanted to clarify a lot of additional points as well as sort of like update the ratings. And I needed to do this one today. I haven't done this on the other days because today's reveal was actually really interesting. I think that certain cards are much better than they look. I think that certain cards are much worse than they look. So I really want to talk about like how to evaluate these cards and their positions. Let me start off though by clarifying like why the ratings have changed so much. So as always, you know, we do these initial impressions. That's just basically like as soon as it comes out, this is like what I'm first thinking about the cards. And then as I go on throughout the day, literally on that same day, I'll often be adjusting some things, sometimes very minorly, sometimes very majorly. And then I'll update all of those in the pinned comment and I tweet out as well. I used to have a section on my website for that, but I have decided to not do it there anymore. So basically, the thing is that a lot of these impressions are changed just off the back of like realizing certain combo pieces or changing the way I'm thinking about a certain card. And it's kind of unfortunate that like it sort of has to be that way because you guys want to see initial impressions, and as like on YouTube it's like too important to get out stuff early, like that's newsworthy because people are interested in like just, you know, seeing the new cards as well. So in some cases, I might do a follow-up video like this where it's such a specific reveal that I want to get like much more in-depth into that I actually like I need to do its own follow-up video. So just to kind of clue you guys in on the process, I'm currently recording this exactly 4 hours after the initial impressions were actually revealed, and I've spent the last 4 hours on stream on Twitch just literally thinking about these cards, talking with chat as well as a ton of other like top level players about like how to best utilize these cards, like different combos that like any one person might just like kind of miss on their own. And I think that's kind of important for like accuracy for sake of evaluation. So I'm just going to get right into evaluations, starting with Shroud of Darkness. So Shroud of Darkness is a card that I really don't expect to be very good. And this was actually surprising to a lot of people in Twitch chat. A lot of people were saying like it looks really good, and I could easily be wrong about this one. But a majority of like the players that I was talking to were also agreeing that they didn't feel like it was going to be a really amazing. I ended up putting it as a This Is Fine Yasuo, which is like, it's an alright card. It might make some sense sometimes, basically. Which isn't to say it's like competitively inviolable, but very niche, and I think depending on how you look at it, it could look a lot better than it is. Really, this is very similar to a Key Guardian, except instead of drawing you a card, it has the upside of enabling Nightfall, basically. That's sort of like the trade-off you're getting. And you're getting Spell Shield instead of Barrier, right? And the +1 attack. But the biggest problem with this is like there's nothing like Key Guardian. You're going to have to pre-commit this in a lot of areas where your opponent just kind of like won't care or won't like interact with your card for that turn anyway, and there's very few things that will pressure them into needing to, right? So you could run this with like They Who Endure. In current decks and current meta, it actually makes some sense because stuff like Harsh Winds counters Atrocity, so you could run this in like current meta They Who Endure. That would be probably totally fine. That's like a pretty niche situation where it can hit where like Atrocity wouldn't, and you know the They Who Endure is very vulnerable without Spell Shield, or you can run it with like some of the Nightfall stuff, but for the most part there's just no an engine would have to be insanely powerful for it to be worth using this on. The biggest thing is that this doesn't counter the opponent's card, it just stops them from using it for a turn. And it's too hard to find a situation where that one turn will make enough of a difference, having to pre-commit so proactively something that your opponent will still be able to answer you in a lot of other ways. In addition, if you want to try to find like some kind of Nightfall trigger, I feel like there's often going to be better triggers for you. For example, you know, Fading Memories is really nice and cheap, and you can even clone additional copies of Nightfall cards. Like you can double play like the Stygian Owl card, for example. And in addition to that, we also have, you know, depending on whatever second region you might be in, you could be in Warning Shot. It's honestly not even impossible for decks like this to consider like Sapling Toss, although I don't think Sapling Toss is necessarily better than Shroud. It's a card that's also kind of clunky in its own way. So it's a little bit of a hot take, but I think this card is being overrated right now. Then we've got Risen Mist, which is a card that when I immediately looked at, I was like, wait, what? That seems terrible. And I think this was everyone's first impression. Everyone's first impression was immediately looking at this card and being like, oh my god, that's awful. I think that this card is actually quite solid. I'm very happy giving it a Vlad emote. I think that this is a card that will greatly empower the Mistwraith archetype. And I think that, in particular, the ability to play an overcosted burst unit at the burst speed is kind of like the most important part, makes up so much for the fact that it is overcosted, right? So a lot of people are evaluating this within the framework of like Mistwraith or Wraith color, and it's really not like that at all. It's not a unit, and it's not trying to be a unit. That's weird, I know, right? Because someone's a unit, so why isn't it a unit? The reason is because it can tap into spell mana, but most importantly, it plays at burst speed without an action. Which means, like, the same reason it costs so much mana is the same reason that cards like Grasp, Withering Wail, and Vengeance cost so mana in the same region as well, which is that the ability to play things at burst or fast speed is incredibly valuable. The fact that in late game positions, my Mistwraith deck, which has access to a lot of Mistwraiths, and this will easily be summoning like a 5 or 6 attack unit, the fact that this will be played into my open attack, I can play this at burst speed, my opponent doesn't get a chance to respond, and then I attack on the same action, that is very, very valuable, and this is always going to be in a game state where I don't really care that much about mana. All I want to be doing at that point in the game, like turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, is making sure that I can use my mana for effective combat value. I want to milk the most out of each combat round, which means I want to be using my mana when my opponent can't use mana. This is why open attacking is so good, because I deny the opponent an action. This is why the ability for, you know, this to be a defensive card, I can use this as a burst blocker, is so good, because I am able to use my mana in that action when my opponent is denying me an action. This is a really, really powerful concept. So what I will say is that, and I made this mistake early on, because for the first like minute I was looking at this card, I didn't really think about it like that, but we haven't seen a proper burst speed unit yet. We of course have Jury Rig, and sometimes you can do some cute things like Jury Rig into Suit Up, and that can be very, very scary. But for the most part, those are decks that are kind of like trying to play for like the early game anyway, and that's a lot more niche. Whereas like this can and very often will be a pretty high value, something that puts actual pressure on the opponent in these mid and late game positions, card that you just play out into your open attack. Again, this would be turn 5 at the very earliest, I think, basically. Now, what is limiting this card a little bit is the Mistwraith archetype itself. I think that Mistwraiths are actually a very, very solid archetype, but the biggest problem with them right now is that the way Shadow Isles is currently operating is, like, they gain most of their, like, tempo value off of stuff like Cursed Caretaker, Cursed Keeper on turn 2 into Blighted Caretaker on turn 3, and the biggest problem with that is basically it's kind of hard to fit Mistwraith in to an archetype like that. You can run Wraith color, but the card Mistwraith itself is a little bit trickier. So I don't know if we're quite going to be able to see this in like super top competitive decks, but this is by no means the garbage card that a lot of people are immediately thinking that it would be. What I can promise you guys is this. The identity of a burst speed like unit that actually has board stats is something that is eventually will one day, when it comes into a big form, is going to be really strong, and I can also guarantee you it's going to be something that people are going to immediately underrate, really, really underrate when it gets revealed and stuff like that. In the same exact way that everyone, when we all looked very, very, very long time ago, when Legends of Runeterra was starting out, everyone was also underrating Grasp, Vengeance, Wail, for the same exact reason, because we're looking at them like a sort of mana in to value out sort of equation, and that's not how we need to be looking at these cards. The mana cost is pretty irrelevant. Decimate also fits into that categorization. Really important, because the whole point of Decimate is you get to gain value on that turn without giving the opponent an action. You do it in a different way, because you open attack and then you play Decimate afterwards. But it's still, that's part of why that card is so good, because you get value that turn without giving your opponent an action. And in the same way that the way Decimate works, it never really matters the mana cost, right? The whole point of Decimate is you're using it in the turns where you have high mana, you're open attacking, so the mana cost is kind of completely irrelevant, right? That's the same with a card like this. So we can't look at this card and be like, oh, well, it's a 4 mana card, so therefore it's going to have to be bad. You are priced into paying mana out the ass for this concept. What will limit this is, if anything, the Mistwraith archetype. We'll see. And then we get to Stalking Shadows. Now, Stalking Shadows is a crazy card. This is, I think, the best card we've seen so far in this expansion. It's a Lux emote for sure. Absolutely ridiculous card. The ability to draw 2 is just like super, super, super good. You get to tutor, like, was sort of a bit of a soft tutor. A card that can potentially help your game plan so you can build around more combo pieces. How I'm personally going to be using this is like the elusive deck that you might have seen I posted on this channel. Maybe there'll be like a link in it's the video that was earlier today. The elusive like combo deck that will also run Encroaching Shadows, and that I think is also going to be very good. That deck will run 3 Stalking Shadows, and I'm actually personally a little scared of that deck's performance. That is starting to look like a really, really, really scary archetype with this, because I will commonly be pulling Green Glade Duos or other elusives with this deck. Even just like cloning up on like Blade Scouts would be really, really good for a combo deck like that. And that can like absolutely just devastate games and have really, really low counter ability. It feels like that deck, like, you know, when you look at that deck's problems, like for the last 2 days, the elusive SI deck, if you don't know which deck I'm talking about, you gotta watch the video, because it's a crazy deck. 2 days ago, that deck's problem was it died to weak sweepers, like Make It Rain or Withering Wail. It doesn't have that problem anymore with Encroaching Shadows. Yesterday, its problem was a lesser problem, but sometimes it kind of like had problems drawing its cards. Duo, as well as like some other like combo finishers, even like Blade Scout's so good drawing off of this and just doubling up. And now it doesn't have that problem either with Stalking Shadows. That's a little crazy. So I will say, I think Stalking Shadows is a really good card and absolutely insane. Of course, you're going to run it in a lot of other decks. You'll run it in like Callisto. You'll run it in like all the Shadow Isle stuff. It's just a good card. It's just kind of a crazy card. I will say a few things about this. So the fact that it, you know, I mentioned before that if all 4 cards on top of your deck are champions or spells, this will brick and won't do a single thing. And if 3 of them are champions or spells, then you're going to be forced to draw the 1 follower. You'll use this, you're going to see 1 follower, and you'll have to click it, right? Because it searches for any card, but you can only pick followers. So we did a little bit of math. I think the average deck has something along the lines of 16 non-followers. My elusive deck currently has about 16 because it's got 16 spells, and a lot of decks run something along the lines of 6 champions, 10 spells. So that's a bit of a rough average, but given that metric, there is about a 2% chance that this card will do nothing at all. Slightly rough math, but it's very close. For purposes here, it's going to be totally fine. There's about a 2% chance that this card will draw a 4 of champions or spells and end up doing nothing. That's pretty low. I'm very happy with those. I'm very happy with that whiff chance being so low. It'll feel kind of shitty sometimes, but it's sort of like, it's going to be kind of the same as like whiffing an allegiance when you have literally like 1 off-color card, basically. It's like a one of, specifically a one of, is roughly the same odds. Okay, now there's a 17% chance that it's going to draw you 3 champs or spells, and you're just going to have the 1 follower. And the other 81% of the time, you're going to have a choice of like 2 or more followers, which is kind of what you want. That's pretty good. I'm very happy with that. It's possible that it's going to be a little bit more rough and hard to fit into decks than me and everyone else is giving it credit for, but everyone like at a high level is agreeing this card is absolutely insane and the best card revealed so far. I think it is going to be dangerous with that elusive deck. I'm actually really scared of that. One thing I will point out about this card is I think it's like really easy to underestimate. If you don't come from card games, it's really easy to underestimate the tutoring value, or another way of putting it is the consistency of a search for. The ability for this card to find you into specific pieces you wanted is actually really, really high when you map out the math. If I'm looking for a Green Glade duo, if I play 1 Stalking Shadows, on average, if I haven't drawn a duo yet, this will give me a roughly 40% chance. This search for will give me a 40% chance of hitting a duo if I haven't drawn one yet, which are the situations where I'm looking for one. That's big. 40, that's probably a lot bigger than it intuitively seems just from a search for, right? But because any of those 4s can be hits, it's the same as basically just waiting 4 turns. That's really, really, really huge. I love that this is in the game. It's really strong. I'm actually not too concerned about its power level in other decks, mostly just the elusive deck. I think that it is healthy to print strong combo pieces like this. This one in particular, it's possible it needs to get nerfed in some way. We'll see. I'm not ready to say anything like that. But one thing I will say is it is good for the game that they are printing strong cards. A lot of people are like worried about power creep and stuff like that. Power creep is not the concern. The bigger concern is when an expansion comes out and a lot of the cards are like very vanilla and bland and don't end up shaking up things very much. Power creep gets a really, really bad rap. It's actually something that when controlled and when accounted for, and when there's like certain variables that are very important to have in place, like for example, set rotations make power creep, you know, you have effectively a reset after a certain point in time, and also just having like a really cheap economy like Legends of Runeterra, having like a healthy amount of power creep is necessary for the meta to keep like, you know, developing and keep kind of like moving forward as new cards get implemented, particularly cards being done in the right way. It's very important that the kinds of, like, people are worried about like the average value. The thing that's more important is the kinds of cards that are powerful. For example, like Grizzled Ranger, I didn't really like that when it was, I mean, nobody liked it in the power level it was kind of ridiculous, and it was like an extremely like vanilla, just kind of not really engaging card. There was nothing really healthy about what that added to the game. So it's important not to obsess about whether the power level is coming up or down, and more about what kinds of cards they are making strong. Next up, we've got Unspeakable Horror. I think this card is actually a lot better than people are giving it credit for. This is another one where everyone is saying, wow, Swim, this is kind of a shit card. I think this card is very good. Same as Risen Mists. I think that people are really criminally underrating these cards. From what I've seen, most people are overrating Shroud of Darkness, but I mean, these are kind of like my takes. Unspeakable Horror is a card that is sort of, I see it as an alt Vile Feast. I think that there's a lot of metagame environments where you actually might consider running this card over Vile Feast. Specifically, this wouldn't necessarily happen in like more metas than not, but that is already in and of itself kind of insane, because Vile Feast is a Lux. That card is like basically auto include in Shadow Isles in most metas. Some decks, some metas cut it down a little bit for sure, but in most metas it's kind of like auto include in Shadow Isles. It's a really, really good card. So Unspeakable Horror has 4 grabs, right? It can pull Unspeakable Horror. I think it can pull itself. We actually don't have complete confirmation on that. There's a few arguments both ways, but the way it's worded in the game consistently, cards that specifically can't pull themselves say another. For example, Inside of Ages says another, like generate another spell, and Warden's Prey says generate another unit. This doesn't say another, so I personally think that this will be able to pull itself. So you can draw itself if you Nightfall it. You can draw Doombeast, which is very good, off of this card. I mean, I don't know if I'd main deck Doombeast, but off of this card, sure, I'd happily draw it. You can draw Stygian Owl, which is all right. It's not really amazing, but, I mean, it's not too incomparable to the Spider. You have to pay a mana and an action to get it there. And you can draw the, like, Doom Pony, which is, of course, a terrible card. But, I mean, any card you're getting for free is kind of, like, valuable, right? So the idea behind this card is, I see it in a few different ways. Basically, Legends of Runeterra will, I think, commonly have meta states where the identity of chump blockers is going to be inherently disvalued. What that means is a meta state where the aggressive decks don't care about chump blockers, which would be something like the burn meta we saw when the Bilgewater expansion launched, where chump blockers were kind of meaningless. In a meta like that, you would very, very, very happily run Unspeakable Horror over Vile Feast, because not only can it can generate itself and it can generate Doombeast, right? Both of them are nuts if we're imagining a meta situation like that, right? Obviously there's a lot of like elusive decks and fearsomes, stuff like that doesn't care about chump blockers, so Vile Feast ends up losing a lot of value in those situations. Also, something that's like really, really important to evaluate this card is that the fact that it has more balanced matchup tables is really, really important. Like, when you look at what both cards do, Vile Feast, both of Vile Feast's effects are kind of like anti-aggro, and it sort of is a brick card against control for that reason, right? Like, it has the ability to, you know, it deals a bit of damage and it heals. That's the drain effect. And that's good against aggro, and it summons a 1/1, which is good against aggro. So it's like an early anti-aggro play. But that means that A, when you draw it in the late game, it's kind of useless. And B, when you draw it against like any sort of slow deck, even if you draw it early, it's completely useless. And that's a really big downside of Vile Feast. Unspeakable Horror is a lot more balanced, because its first effect, the drain, same as Vile Feast, is good against aggro, and its second effect is good in the slower matchups, because it has the ability to basically give you the draw. So it's got more balanced matchup tables in that way. Now, this is a good thing overall. There are some kind of tech cards that you would want to like double commit to helping certain things, but overall, you're getting a little bit more value out of having a more even spread of tables, because the value you get out of like doubling down on a certain like matchup is always going to be lower than the value you get from basically making sure that you have a card that is never going to be bricked. Now, the exception to this, I guess I shouldn't have said the word always. The exception to this is the identity of a tech card, which is something that is something that you are running because there's a certain meta deck that is very, very, very prominent. The only problem with that is that Vile Feast isn't really actually a tech card at all. It's a card that you're just kind of like running for the value of it, and because you do need some like decent like early boards, some like somewhat stabilizers. And Unspeakable Horror sacrifices a little bit in the early game to get the ability to not be completely useless in control. It can deal late game damage. This can target the Nexus because, of course, unlike Vile Feast, this can target the Nexus. And when you're looking at this as a finisher, this has an average of 2 or more Nexus damage, right? Given the Nightfall cards we've seen so far, of course, this is all subject to change when they reveal more Nightfall cards. There's going to be like Diana's going to have her Targon set of Nightfall cards as well to pair with Nocturne's Shadow Isle set. But basically, it deals an average of 2 damage to Nexus if you're using it as an over-the-top finisher. Why an average of 2? Because there's 4 potential hits for this card. If it can hit itself, it's one of them. And we have a total of 3 damage within those 4 average hits. Itself and Doombeast. Doombeast, of course, hits 2. So that's a total of 3 damage across 4, which is a total of 0.75 in the addition to 1, which means... But because this gets itself, it is not itself a 1. It kind of recurses, and you end up mathematically with something that is overall more than at 2 average damage to the opponent Nexus, which seems insignificant and it often won't make a difference. But when your opponent is low and you do need a little bit of reach, this can easily be what you need to win the game. It won't happen very commonly, but even if it happens in just a few percent of games, that is a few percent win rate swing where Vile Feast won't save you. And of course, it's good in Nightfall archetype too, but I'm basically just saying, like, people are underrating this card outside of Nightfall. That being said, after it's all said and done, I'm not saying this card is better than Vile Feast overall. I'm saying it's a lot closer than people give it credit for, and there will be certain meta states where it is better than Vile Feast. And that's why I'm giving it a swoon. I think that people are underrating this card. When I look at this card and I say I think it's like potentially an alt Vile Feast, people were in chat today saying like, oh man, Swim, you're kind of crazy. A lot of people. And this is my perspective on the card. It could end up being, it might be pretty rare that there are metas where we replace Vile Feast with Unspeakable Horror. I think it's not really about like whether it will happen or not. The real question is how commonly will that happen, right? Because I can guarantee you, I can literally guarantee you, not even close, the burn meta that we had, the burn deck, you would run Unspeakable Horror in that meta. If we had that meta again, you would have run this card, right? You might run like this plus Vile Feast, possibly. I'm not sure, but this card would see play in a match, in an archetype like that, absolutely. So it's just a matter of like how often we're going to have meta states where you would run this card, potentially in some crazy situations in addition to Vile Feast, or in some situations over Vile Feast. And then we get to Nocturne, the guy himself. So Nocturne, as you can see, is a Heimerdinger emote here, and I'm going to go ahead and explain why, because you've probably been wondering the entire video. I think that Nocturne is a card that is missing some key tools to really make sense yet, and I'll explain why I feel that way. But basically, he's waiting for the rest of the Diana package, because Diana is also probably going to have some kind of Nightfall synergy. She's going to be in Targon. Like, Shadow Isles and Targon are going to have this nice, like, Nightfall deck between them, and basically, until then, he's sort of, like, missing that home. Now, why is he incomplete right now? Because Nocturne currently doesn't really know whether he's an aggro or a mid-range card. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically aggro, and I've defined this a little bit differently in the past, and the other people define it a little bit differently, and there is a bit of a blurry line sometimes, but I would say the cleanest way in Runeterra to define it is that aggro is defined by its board independent finishers, and mid-range is defined by its board dependent finishers. So it's about whether you need to be able to have units on board at the start of your final like attack or finisher or whatever. At the start of that turn, whether you need to have units on board is how I would kind of like draw the line. So let's clarify that a little bit. So what that would mean is that the idea of something like a Scouts deck, which I have actually in the past a couple of times called like an aggro deck, and a lot of people see it as an aggro deck, but I would currently be defining that as a mid-range deck. The idea of like Cythria or Genevieve being your finishers, being a board defendant, you have to have units on board to reliably finish games with that deck. Darrowing is interesting because Darrowing I would absolutely consider to be an aggro deck. It doesn't really, you don't see Darrowing around that much, but that's the Darius Harrowing deck that we saw a ton of in the like a couple of patches ago. And that's an aggro deck because you spend the entire game like sacrificing your units, and at the very end, in your finisher turn, you are board independent. You have an empty board, you play Harrowing, and then you swing in and you win. It's a little weird because I know like it's a board independent finisher that, I mean, you're attacking with units, you're attacking with the board, but the point is you can go into your final turn and you can have no board and you can win. That's the idea. So a lot of elusive decks would fit that characterization as well, which is the idea of like if your opponent's at low health, which they should be, you're an aggro deck, you will be able to play Decimate, or you will be able to play one or two cheap elusive units, and even though you don't really have a board, still just like close the game out in that way, right? So Nocturne is more of a mid-range card. We can see here that he has the ability to, you know, basically require having a board for the payoff to be there. He's sort of like Ashe in that he has the ability to, you know, he's got the same exact stat line as Ashe. His flip condition is probably going to happen at a similar timing as Ashe, but the thing is that he has, you know, he also needs to have a board to attack to be able to win, just like Ashe does. So they're kind of all mid-range in those respects. Here's the big problem, which is fearsome as an aggro keyword, straight up. The whole point of fearsome is to kind of like ignore like board states and deal early aggressive chip damage. Like turn one, you're playing stuff like Precious Pet, even like the Stygian Owl card that we were talking about earlier, that's a 1 mana to like, it can deal 4 damage, and it does so off of like early fearsome combos. The identity of a Nightfall deck that was running like that Stygian Owl, you would be getting that early chip damage in, like turn 2, you'd get that early 4 damage in, and that's going to be your win condition. The problem is that mid-range doesn't rely on early chip damage. And the idea of like Nocturne really doesn't work that well with the idea of some of the other cards in that package, like the Owl, right? Because that is a pure aggro card. So you see now the problem, which is to be able to flip Nocturne, you need to have that Nightfall archetype. You're going to be running 3 Stygian Owls. You're going to get a lot of this early chip damage in. Here's the problem. The problem is that when you've dealt a lot of early chip damage, when you've done those attacks, if the opponent has answers, you've lost the game already, no matter what. And if they don't have answers, then they're going to be at a low enough health where the identity of Nocturne as a finisher is going to be overkill and disruptible. And that's kind of the whole distinction of the archetype, is that aggro gets in that damage when they don't have blockers, and then it'll sacrifice the board. Now, it'll abandon the board at a variable turn. Some forms of aggro have abandoned the board as early as turn 2, which is crazy, right? But like old school, like PNZ burn style, like Noxus aggro was basically after, when the Precious Pet can attack on 1, Boom Kuruki can attack on 2, and there's some matchups and some hand states where you already don't care about the board, which is absolutely crazy. That's an extreme case in an extreme archetype, but the point is sometimes it's as late as just abandoning the board after turn like, 6 or 7, which is around where like Darrowing would often abandon the board. But the whole point is having that like board independent finisher while just dealing chip damage. And usually, because you're dealing so much chip damage, the opponent is going to be at low health. So you want a finisher that plays for low damage and high reliability, or low counterability is another way of saying it. And this is the fundamental distinction. This is why Decimate is such a good card, even though it looks maybe a little weaker if you're a new player. And this is why Decisive Maneuver is such a bad card, even though it probably looks insane as a new player. I know it did to me when I was a new player. Decisive Maneuver looked crazy. That's it. Decimate is an aggro card, and Decisive Maneuver is fundamentally, at least, a mid-range card, right? This is the problem with a card like that, Decisive Maneuver, that Nocturne shares, which is it's trying to be aggro in some ways, and it's trying to be mid-range in other ways, and it just ends up being a little too confused. When you compare this to Ashe, you'll see that immediately. Ashe's, instead of having Fearsome, she does Frostbites, which are great for, like, mid-range, and her archetype, her trigger for level up, is Freezes, which is great for mid-range, because it allows you to survive against aggressive strategies. It allows you to trade the board against mirrors, like mid-range mirrors. You have the Frostbites, which is what you're going to use to survive, and eventually, your defensive cards, your Frostbite cards, will eventually be part of how you win, because you can do, like, a Harsh Winds attack with Ashe and win the game. She is a mid-range card, and everything about her really knows that. That's great. Her stat line kind of doesn't know that, and that's why she's been, like, sort of awkward. That's the one thing. Her 4-5-3 stat line is the one thing about her that's not, like, pure mid-range, but that's fine. She works. Nocturne, his payoff is mid-range, but his, like, body and text, as well as his level up condition, are aggro. Some of his support cards are mid-range, and some of his support cards are aggro. Now, you might ask, well, why can't you combine aggro and mid-range together and kind of get something kind of in between? We use words like tempo, we use words like zoo. Honestly, different people define all of these words in kind of like different ways, so it's not necessarily like super clear cut. But I think the most clean way in Runeterra is to define it is by that finisher metric, by whether you are relying on being able to maintain any sort of ownership of the board to close out games, because therein lies the rub. And this is why aggro and midrange don't necessarily mix. It's sort of like oil and water a little bit, and there are some... You can always imagine exceptions, right? You can always imagine a card that would be printed in a way that it would give an exception. But basically, aggro is all about getting in chip damage so that your opponent's mid-game blockers are rendered completely useless, right? So that you'll eventually transition into the over-the-top burn. It could be burn, it could be elusives, but it's something that will be able to go through your opponent having a board and you not having a board. And because you've dealt the chip damage early, you have the ability to sacrifice the damage for the reliability. Because you've done the chip damage early, we can cut Decisive Maneuver and add Decimate, and it's better because we don't need more than 4 damage. The opponent's going to be at like 4 health. They're going to die to the Decimate, and the reliability is much more valuable. So that's the fundamental problem with Nocturne, because the whole point of his level up, to get the level up, you have to play an aggro game plan, which means you have to attack a lot, which means you should expect your units to die, because attacking on average, like, you can't expect your opponent to play nothing. They will do things, and attacking will ultimately cause your units to die. That's how you level up Nocturne. But once he's leveled up, you suddenly need a board, right? That's his whole payoff. His whole payoff is that, you know, you play more units, you know, he gets +1/+1, but your other allies have Fearsome, right? And that's kind of like a sort of like Cythria style finisher, right? And that's kind of the mid-range. And they don't really mix that well together, because against any sort of like decent deck or decent opponent, you, at that point of the game where your Nocturne would be flipping, you'd rather just play Decimate, because they should have low health. They should, like, unless they've completely countered with you, in which case you probably can't win anyway, that's fine, just, you know, next game. They should have low health, and you want something that is less greedy as a finisher. You want something that's just reliable, that can get less countered. Whereas, like, Nocturne, like, to get value out of him, he forces you to, like, develop, because you have to play a unit to get the -1 attack effect, and that makes you vulnerable to a lot of things, like Sejuani coming down, like, any sort of, like, you know, like, there's so many things that makes you vulnerable to. But also any sort of like spells the opponent might be playing, they can counter you with like combat trick blockers, like Fury blocker even, that Decimate would be able to get through. So what is Nocturne's one saving grace? Well, that Diana is going to be added to the game with more Nightfall cards, more combo pieces, and that she will almost certainly represent a more solidified direction in the mid-range style, I think. I can't be sure of that, but Targon is very just kind of like mid-range overall. They tend to have like good value and less aggression, and that Diana's Targon package will kind of skew a bit more of the mid-range style and a bit less of the aggro style. So as soon as that happens, Nocturne might be able to have enough like Nightfall triggers and like have enough conditions, maybe a couple of Nightfall allies that can attack without dying, for this card to be able to make sense. But until then, it just kind of really doesn't, and in my opinion is just far too confused as a card. Basically, a lot of people are comparing this to Ashe, and it's very, very, very flawed. I hope you guys understand now my perspective on this card and why I feel like that's not a fair comparison to make, and Ashe makes a lot of sense as a card, and Nocturne does not. Now, it's important to understand that the idea of a champion that is sort of like trying to do a couple of different things at once is not necessarily going to be bad by definition. For example, Callista is a little bit of both as well, and Callista as a champion I think is very good. So it's a great sort of like devil's advocate example, right? Because Callista is like, her level up condition is aggro, her stat line is aggro, her fearsome is aggro, but her level up payoff is pretty fundamentally mid-range. It's like, it's playing for the board, it's playing in a very like disruptible and blockable way, it's like long-term value, right? Because you can attack multiple times, and it's a way that like in the aggro condition you're not really closing out games. So what's going on with Callista? Here's the big difference between these cards, which is that Callista's value is not really predicated on either game plan really making sense. At the end of the day, she's a 3-mana 4/3. She has a pretty easy time flipping, a very low commitment deck building cost. She doesn't have much of a deck building cost, right? So you don't really need to be one singular archetype to run her, right? Because all you have to do is have a few allies die, and it's kind of okay if you're running her and like the allies aren't dying. And on top of that, because her level up is kind of just like so strong, even aggro has the ability to sometimes utilize it just because it's a really, really powerful effect. Nocturne doesn't really have any of those luxuries. Nocturne doesn't really have the ability with his stat line and his payoffs and his enabler. Like, he's harder to enable. It's more of a commitment. You have to really go out of your way to build a deck, right? His stat line is weaker because, of course, you know, paying 1 extra mana for 1 attack is very, very much not worth it. And even his payoff is weaker and more committal. His payoff is something that can only require a specific sort of board state or deck type to make sense. So that's the biggest difference between them. With Nocturne, he doesn't really have the luxury of being able to be an all-right card when his effective game plan isn't working. So he's a card that is sort of just like trying to do two things, and he has to be able to do one of them effectively to be worth using at all. And neither can be done effectively in his case. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I had to say. It's actually crazy. I didn't expect this recording to go on so long. This has been, I mean, I don't know how long it ended up, but it's like at least 40 minutes, I think. I have no idea. I had a lot to talk about. Today's reveals were great. I loved it. This has all just been like, I think all of these cards is actually super interesting to break down because there's so many different angles of evaluation, and the way I'm evaluating these cards is overall pretty different from how like a lot of you guys, a lot of other people are evaluating these cards. I'm gonna be very, very interesting looking at this bundle if we see like, you know, I mean, there's so many divisive picks here. Probably at least one thing you're looking on the screen right now is got to be something I'm dead wrong about. Probably like one thing, because like this is like super, super crazy. These in particular, these 5 cards, a lot of people are saying, you know, I think that Unspeakable Horror is, I'm overrating it, or a lot of people are saying Risen Mist is complete garbage. Rattling Bones really likes Risen Mist. I think he likes it better than I do. Shroud of Darkness, some people are actually very, very much liking Shroud of Darkness, and my approach to that is actually a bit more middling. There's a lot of people that think it's complete garbage and will never make any sense. So yeah, this is going to be a super interesting one to kind of like time capsule and check back on. We'll have to see. But yeah, I will say, you know, Nocturne could be fine when we see Diana's part of it. Who knows? But it's something that, like, its current direction, it doesn't just need more help, it needs a shift in direction. And the only reason I think it has potential is because I expect Targon to be the direction that makes sense for him. All right, I hope you guys at least like learned a little bit something from this. I love these longer videos that are able to kind of like, see, I love the in-depth kind of analytical stuff where you guys can like learn something out of it. And I want to be able to kind of like change the way you think about the game, and help see other perspectives. Because I firmly believe there's kind of never really one right answer. When I say change the way you think about the game, I don't mean to imply I'm bettering the way you think about the game, although I should hope that is kind of a byproduct. But it's more about being able to see things from different angles and to never be stuck on like one set way of evaluating things, you know? Because it's just important to sort of like have a bunch of different ways to look at things and kind of consider them all together, right? Because that's kind of like, that's the only way we're going to have that sort of fair, objective perspective, if we can kind of look through it from a lot of different lenses. And I know that they're probably going to be like less popular on YouTube. These kinds of videos just, the general like YouTube audience is like less interested in this on average than the kind of like more shorthand, bite-sized, digestible stuff. The reality of it is most people just want, you know, what deck do I play to win game? Okay, thanks very much. Bye. Kind of thing. So, you know, props to you if you're, I mean, if you're watching this, you are the kind of guy who's, you know, sticking around until the end, making sure that you're learning something and kind of enjoying the kind of like analysis and just like thinking about these as much as I enjoy it. All right, guys. But anyway, that's just my little Easter egg for those of you who stuck around till the end. And I'll see you guys tomorrow for more reveals.